Good morning, everyone. Today is Wednesday. We are learning the second Perek of Demai. Um, we're less than a week away from Rosh Hashanah. I think we're going to get to most of the Masechta done before Rosh Hashanah. I think we're going to have to finish it on some B'dayas, if I'm counting correctly. Anyways, today's shir is sponsored Lila Nishmas Aaron Nachman Simcha Cohen, Yeshua Mordechai Ben Shepsel, Bracha Sar Bashmolei, Binyamin Moshe Ben Yosef, and Moshe Yitzchak Ben Reb Shraga Feivel. And may the Neshamas have an aliyah. And as a refuah shlema for Adasar Bas Leah B'Sok Shar Chole Yisrael. Amen. Okay, so we learned yesterday in Mishnah Bays that um, parts of Eretz Yisrael that were not Kaddish after Galus Bavel, they came back to build the second base of Mikdash. They were no longer um, you would not take Trumas Maisis off the produce or grain that grew in those areas that were not Mekudesh by the Oli Bavel. Now we're going to talk about produce that was grown in Eretz Yisrael, was grown locally, and it was exported out of Eretz Yisrael. So Mishnah Aleph starts off, Elo Devarim Ashrim Demai Bechol Makom. These types of produce be you must take meiser of the mai in all places, even in Chutz La'aretz. Hadavela, Tamarim, Charuvim, Ha'orez, Kamu. So the vela is pressed figs, Tamarim are dates, and Charuvim is carob, and Ha'orez is rice, and Kamun is cumin. But you're gonna say, what, we have those things available in other parts of the world, so why are these? What's so special about these? And according to the Mishnah, these five have a superior variety or type that grew in Israel and nowhere else. You had these five things in other places, but not to this level, not to this quality or um, chashivas. What was so special about them? The figs were incomparably sweet. The dates were very large. The carobs were straight and beautiful, and the rice was extremely white. I'm not exactly sure what was so special about the cumin, but it falls into the same category. I think I remember seeing recently, like in the past couple of years, that they found date seeds from going back to like Bias Rishon or Bias Sheni, and they planted them, and they actually grew, and they produced a crop, and now you're able to get dates in Eretz Yisrael. I think there were dates that were similar to come from the dates that they had back during the Zman of Bias, which is pretty cool. I never had them myself, but I'm sure they're pretty expensive. But they are out there, so they are of a higher quality than the rest of the produce. So you find these five things in Chutz La'aretz, yeah, then you'd have to be mafresh mice on them if they were demai. Um, so now produce that grows in Chutz La'aretz is not subject to the laws of demai, but the Rabbanim decreed that things that are imported to Eretz Yisrael are subject to demai, because they did that because they didn't want people to get confused with the produce in Israel and the produce from outside. So they uh, they instituted that if it comes in and it's demai, you need to be my fish mice. Now, I'm not exactly sure how it's classified as Demai if if it's from, let's say, America and you're importing to Eretz Yisrael. So it's not Demai because you never had to be my fish choice mice on it. So it's not Tevel. So it's interesting. Ha'orez shebechutz la'aretz, rice that grows outside Eretz Yisrael, kol ha'mishtamish remember potter. Whoever uses it, even in Eretz Yisrael, is potter from the Mai because 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 the variety of rice that grows outside Eretz Yisrael looks very different from the rice that grows in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore people will not get confused between the two of them. Mishnah Beis. Okay, so now we have three levels of people. You have an Am Aretz, you have a Naaman, and you have a Chaver. An Am Aretz is someone who's not so observant of of Torah law. He's he does he is very careful about truma and kachim because those are more chomer, but all the other things he's more makelah. So now, someone Mishnah Beis talks about someone who wants to elevate his rank to a neman. What's a neman? Hamakabel alavlios neman. Someone who wants to accept upon himself the standard of conduct to be trusted. And neman is meant to be trusted. So we trust him. He's not yet a chaver. We'll talk about chaver soon. Um, so in order to earn that status of being trusted, being a neman regarding Demai, he has to accept these rules. Number one, Meiser es ochel. He must um, he must accept upon himself to give Meiser on everything that he eats, including the mind. The eshu mocher, and the same applies to anything that he grows and sells. He has to give Meiser. The eshu lokech, and anything that he buys from an Aretz and then resells, he has to give Meiser on that. If he does that on all three counts, he will be elevated from Am Aretz to the level of a Naaman. And then the next one is a Machokas. Ve'eno misarech etzel Am Aretz. He must also, he's got to find new friends. He can't be the guest of an Am Aretz for a meal anymore because his host food is Demai. And he's being makbid on that. So Yehuda argues with the Tanakama and says, Av hamisarech etzel am aretz nema. Even if someone who joins an am aretz as his guest is trusted, because he's there for a social obligation. He's not really there to, because he's participating with a social obligation. It doesn't mean that he's not careful with his own stuff. Amrulo, so the Chachamim said back to Rabbi Yehuda, Al Atzma Eno Naman, if he's not trusted with regard to himself, since he eats foods that are demai in the house of the Amaretz, Kate said here, Naman Al Shalachem. And how can he be trusted regarding what he sells to others? It's the guy who keeps kosher in the house, but he goes and eats treif outside the house. Like, how do you trust this guy's conscience? But since he's not careful himself to keep all the mice requirements, then the produce he sells must be considered the mai, and he is not yet elevated to the level of a nama. Okay. Now we're gonna go on to the next level about someone who wants to be a chaver. The difference between a naman and a chaver is that a naman is specifically relating to meiser, and a chaver is referring to taharos, which is more chum. It's a lot more complicated. It's more chamer, and um, basically a chaver is committing to eat chulin only if it's tahor, even though this is not a biblical requirement, and he has to being makbid on any intaharis. If it becomes wet, foods that foods that are mukshal makabel tuma, meaning that they became wet and therefore they became tame. They That's a problem. So now foods can only be tame from a liquid from seven liquids, and this comes up all over Shas. It's yad shachat dam, wine, yayin, dam, which is wine and blood. Shachat is shemen, chalav, and tal, which is oil, olive oil, milk, and dew, and then it's devash and mayim, honey and water. Um, and if it gets wet with anything else, then it's not mekabel tumah. Okay, so Mishnah Gillah starts off. Amikabel alav lios chaver. Someone who accepts upon himself to be a chaver wants to get to that status of that to the higher level status. You must keep the following commitments, and you must make these commitments in front of three other chaverim. It's almost like a basin of chaverim have to be. It gives him like a trial period of 30 days, and if he completes this, then he's considered to be a chaver. It's almost like a basin. He must not sell any food to an am aretz, whether wet or dry, because why? Because the am aretz might make the food tummy when he touches it, and it's forbidden to cause tumah in Eretz Yisrael, tumah to food in Eretz Yisrael, even if it's chula, there's a problem. You must also not buy from the Amaretz food that was once wet, because we assume that the Amaretz made a tummy. And you must not be a guest in the house of Amaretz, since because he may become tummy there. Whereas we said before that the Naaman, there's a machlokas whether he could or could not eat by an Amaretz, but by a Chaver, you absolutely cannot do that. Normally, he have an Amaretz as a guest, and the Amaretz is wearing his own clothing. So because he might come to touch the host, and then become tame. So, but if the guest is going to come into your house, and you're going to give him like a fresh pair of clothes to wear that are clean and tar, then that's probably not a problem. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says the following things, which the Chachamim have a problem with. He must also not raise small domestic animals, being sheep and goats in Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because they tend to graze in other people's fields, and um, one second, right? Because they wander off and they graze unlawfully into other people's fields, and it. It's not a Tumah Tahara problem, but it's more like a gezel, and um, that's not a good thing. So I was wondering today. I don't have an answer for this question just yet, but we have by the Avos that we know that the Avos Hakadoshim kept Kol Torah Kula before Matan Torah, and I was wondering like what happened to all the lava, because here you have a Yehuda saying that you shouldn't grow small domestic animals like sheep and goats, and we know that the others had large flocks. So what was the problem? And even you have the Meister with the Run and Lot, where they part ways because Lot's animals were grazing in other people's fields. Um, so how did that not apply over here? I guess you could maybe you could say that since the whole land belonged to a Ram anyways, maybe that wasn't such an issue back then. It was an issue later on, but Tzarech Ian on that point. This is the Mishnah issue. It's not a Chumash issue, so I don't know. Below Yehei Paris Benadarim B'Sachot, and he may not. He cannot make nadarim. You cannot make vows like freely or act with like lightheadedness. Because someone who makes a lot of Nadarim which are very serious, it's very common to make a neder, shvuah, or all the other types of oaths. Um, Someone who makes a lot of vows is likely to transgress some of them and cause a problem. And a schok and kalas rosh, like lightheadedness and like leads to immorality, which is the problem. Now, schok is different from simcha. Person has to be simcha at all times. Um, the simcha comes up a lot of times through the Torah. Just had it in Kisava last week, but schok and lightheadedness is um, is a big problem, and it's different from simcha. Lo yehei tamid mesim, tamid mesim, and he must not allow himself to become tummy to a dead body. Because again, we're talking about tumatar over here. The mishamish bebeis medrash. Oh, going back on, onto the Durham. Okay, just going back a second. About a Durham, even a Nazir, we're told that a Nazir he has to bring a chatas after he finishes the Naziris, because even though he reached a uh, a a high level of status of kedusha, but really it was it was he has to bring a chatas because he was more machrid than the Torah had required him to be, and therefore there's like a little shtickle chet over there. And the Shamish Bebeis Medrash going on with the Mishnah that he must this guy who wants to be a Chaver, he has to serve the Talmid Chachamim in the Beis Medrash. Amrullah, but the Chazal said to him, Lo bo elu leklau. All these things that Yehuda just put out there are not included since they are unrelated to Tumah, and therefore he could be a Chaver even without accepting these additional commands. He has the original four that were mentioned in the first part of the Mishnah, but according to the Chachamim, these things that Yehuda are said are null and void. They're not related 100% to Taharis. Moving on to Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Daled is talking about about produce that are done for business. Okay, like you have wholesalers, you have manufacturers, you have distributors, you have wholesalers, you have retailers, you have the customer. Yeah, you got the normal economy over here. So, Hanachtomim lo chivu osam chachamim harfish elek de chmas ma'aser challah. Commercial bakers who are trusted regarding maestros, but they bought the grain from which they baked the bread from an amaretz. So Chazal required them to be mafresh challah and chumas meiser from the dough only. They had to be mafresh from the dough only the amount that fills the requirements of chumas meiser and challah. He has to give challah, 1/48 of the dough, and give it to the kohen. Right. So the problem is that since they're required to remove the tumas meiser and challah, commercial bakers that they made a very little profit because they have to give it to the retailers, and therefore they weren't Chazal did not want to burden them with transporting Ma'aser Sheni to Yerushalayim. So they weren't high with them with that. Hachanvanim Einon B'Shayin Limkor Es Demai. the retail shopkeepers who sell in small quantities and they have a higher profit, they are not allowed to sell Demai without first separating Meisers, including Meiser Shem. Whereas that leniency was given to the wholesalers, but not to the retailers. But since the shopkeeper is making a larger profit, they were required to separate the Meisers. Like, if you think about it, when it comes to sales tax, it's a different category, but sales tax is kind of works a little bit separately, a little bit similarly, where it's not the manufacturer doesn't pay sales tax, the distributor doesn't pay sales tax, the wholesaler doesn't pay sales tax. Once it gets to the retailer, then the retailer is charging the customer sales tax, and that's who pays it because the other three legs, they're not making that huge of a profit, but the retailer is the one who's paying the sales tax. Now you can think, sales tax is the same item, they the same item. Um, the state is making more money on sales tax than the retailer because he's having a higher profit. Anyways, but it's similar over here where they imposed the Meister's obligation onto the retail shopkeeper and not to the manufacturer, the distributor, or the wholesaler. Kol hamashpiim amid the gasa v'shayin limker es hadamai. All those who sell with a large measure are permitted to sell demai without taking meiser. Meaning that they're doing a wholesale, so they can sell demai without taking meiser money. So the buyer is responsible to be mafresh the meiser. Elu hein hamashpiim midagasa. So who are those who sell with such a large measure that they're not required to tie to meiser the produce? Kegon asitonos mokritua. For example, the wholesalers and the grain sellers. You just said that's the one level up where they're selling to many shopkeepers and many retailers, and their profit is not huge, even though the selling volume, but the profit per piece is not tremendous. So therefore, they pass the Meiser requirement on the Mai over to the shopkeeper. And finally, Mishnah Hey, we're talking about, we're continuing with Mishnah Dalid. Remeir says, Esh Darka Limante Begasa Manado Bedaka. Something that is usually measured with a large quantity means it's sold in large large amounts. But was in this case measured with a small measurement to fail a daka legasa, and the small measurement is insignificant relative to the large one. And it's considered as if the sale was done with the large measure because we followed the usual practice and not the actual practice. Since it's usually sold in this way and not in the other way, then it's going to be a problem. Like if you remember, like during COVID, when all the restaurants and all the hotels were shutting down, I remember seeing they had potato farms where their whole supply was now clogged up because they had all these potatoes, all this produce that usually went to these large customers, and they wound up wasting it all, just like throwing it into landfills and wasting it all because they couldn't deal with the smaller quantities. So you guys say, why didn't they just rebag it and give it out to the consumer? Because their business was not set up for that manner. They set this some huge quantities, and to then put them into, let's say, 5-pound bags or 10-pound bags, the consumer was not practical enough to do that. They wound up going to waste. That was back in COVID. So continuing, Esh Darka Limate Bedaka, but the Begasa is something that's usually measured in a small measure, but was in this case measured with a large measurement instead. Like usually to fail the guy to the donkey, then the large measure is insignificant relative to the small one. Again, because you have to do it with the usual method and not with the actual demand. So this is normally sold in this way, and even though you sold it with a different measurement, that's not the way it's normally sold. Therefore, it's not worth anything. So Ezo he meet the guy. So what is a large measure? How do you define that? Yavesh shloshes kavim. For dry foods, it is 3 kavs. The kav is the measure equal to the volume of 24 eggs. If that helps you at all. So velach a dinar. But for liquids, it is the amount that can be purchased for a dinar, which is a monetary value. So what does that mean? Why is why is by the dry foods um its volume, but by liquid it's by the dollar amount? Because because that's the way people talk. When people go into buy they go to buy eggs. They say, "Give me 1 dozen, 2 dozen, 5 dozen." They're not saying, "Oh, give me $20 worth of eggs." They're getting 3, 4, 5 dozen eggs. But when you go to the gas station to fill up your car, you don't say, "Give me 3 gallons of gas." You say, "Give me 20, 30, $50 of gas." Or fill it up, whatever it is, fill it up. I need a full car. Because that goes by the dollar amount and not by the actual value. We finish off with a case. Rabbi Yossi says, "Sale te'enim, sale anavim, the kupos shoyarek." Regarding baskets of figs and baskets of grapes and boxes of vegetables, Kozman shehu mochron aksara pater. As long as he sells them by estimation, he's not weighing them, he's not measuring them, he's just like approximating. He is exempt from taking the Demai off of them. Because why? Because when it's estimated, then the seller will need to add extra produce, which reduces his profit. Therefore, he is exempt from Meiser when he sells such a large amount. And that is all for today. We'll see you tomorrow for Perek Gimel of Demai. Have a wonderful day.